We got Brad Tejeda on the line from Canes Insight. Check out his work. Just plug in Canes Insight right here on YouTube, and you can check out the channel. Plenty of Miami Hurricanes talk for you to look at there. All right. You know, in regards to what was accomplished or not accomplished, depending on your perspective, I certainly hear the good and the bad and the positive and negative, depending on that approach from that particular fan of what happened in 2020. So I don't know that this, considering the talent on this roster versus the division, that it could get much worse than 2019. You know, losing to FIU and Duke and Georgia Tech, losing to teams like that with this kind of talent and getting shut out in a bowl game. So there was the obvious improvement in record. You go to 8-3 coming off 6-7. You can look at much improvement at the quarterback position, a better field goal kicker that can make the kicks. Those were two obvious upgrades. Offensive coordinator, Rhett Lashley, compared to Dan Enos. Do you feel as though, you know, there are easy ways to mark the improvement in 2020, but there are also ways to look at it and say, did you really need to struggle against the likes of Pitt and Virginia Tech every week in those games? NC State, you pull that one out after being down by 10 in the fourth quarter. They're a decent team, but still kind of messing around with those 500 kind of teams in the Coastal. How do you assess 2020, whether it gave you hope for the future or you just feel there's a long ways to go still?
I mean, obviously going to 2020 before the season started, I think most Hurricane fans had a little bit of hope. I mean, when you add a guy like Rhett Lashley and a dynamic player like De'Aaron King, there's a lot of hope there. I think what we wanted to see was that spark in the offense, and I think we did see that. The problem is, especially with the Hurricanes team, it seems like we're never able to get on the same page and have the offense and the defense and the special teams working all fluently in a football game. And you're still seeing that, especially in 2020. There were bright moments for the offense, and then there were bright moments for the defense. You go to that Duke game, that was one of those games where a lot of fans, you know, were honed in on Blake Baker getting fired and him not being a great defensive coach, which, I mean, I don't disagree. But you look at that game in particular, along with the Florida State game, which is obviously a big rivalry game. Those are two games that stood out where, I mean, not only on paper, but when you see the eye test, they passed every single thing possible, whether it be on offense, defense, special teams. And then you go to a team like North Carolina. I mean, that's the game that pretty much gives all of us fans nightmares. It's a team that obviously Coach Mack Brown, who has taught Manny Diaz. I think that's one of the issues that you're starting to see with Manny Diaz is he's not able to adjust, especially when he's going against, you know, some of the guys that kind of taught him, right? And I think when you really look at is Manny Diaz knows that in this 2021 year, him being in his third year, this is make or break year. You look at some of the great coaches that we try to compare ourselves to, the Nick Sabans, the Dabo Sweeneys. Manny Diaz is nowhere close to that, let's be honest. But when you go back to Nick Saban, when you go back to Dabo Sweeney, when they first started as a head coach, it wasn't until their third year when they started actually producing quality wins and having key opponent wins. And I think this is where Manny Diaz comes in play. And he knows, just like all of us Cane fans, that this is make or break year. De'Aaron King came back. Most of your guys who you thought usually would declare for the draft comes back. And you add extraordinary coaches onto this staff. I mean, this is probably on paper one of the best coaching staffs that the Miami Hurricanes football team has had in quite a long time. You bring in a guy like T-Rob, who is a secondary coach that's already been proven at multiple colleges, has produced NFL guys such as Vernon Hargraves and a few other names as well. But the Coach Simpson hire is just as good just because he's already been at the University of Miami. He has proven he knows exactly what it takes to get done at this program. And especially going back to that North Carolina game, the trenches, specifically in the D-line, the gap interior, following your assignments, that's something that Jeff Simpson hones on. And that's one of his strengths. And then, you know, the other hire is Bob Shoop. The Bob Shoop hire, in my opinion, kind of gave me kudos and a pat on the back to Manny Diaz, because I think one thing that a lot of fans were a little concerned about is the staff that we've had in place the past couple of years were all what they say yes men, right? Guys who didn't really want to, you know, go against Manny's word in a sense, or Manny was kind of just the only authoritative guy because everyone that was under him were his guys. Well, now he brings in T-Rob, who demands a lot more. You bring in a coach, Jeff Simpson, who was a prior head coach in Georgia for over 20, 25 years and has, credibility at the Atlanta Falcons organization, and Bob Shoop, who has over 30 years of experience. That alone right there told me that Manny Diaz is open to learning and asking for advice. And I go back to the Ask Madden button in a video game. I think now this is the year where Manny Diaz has an Ask Shoot button, where we're going to be able to game plan, in prior games before. And I think that's something that hurt, especially in that North Carolina game.
Well, not to dwell on 2020, but you did go to the North Carolina game a number of times. And this is what was meaningful to me about that game. And this is what I took away from that game. I looked at the schedule and thought, if Miami plays not what they did in 2019, if they play reasonably up to expectations, they're so much better than everybody on the schedule except Clemson and North Carolina. So Clemson, I was curious to see, but we saw it determined that Clemson is still significantly better. So we saw that. And then I'm looking at the rest of the schedule and thinking, as long as I'm watching Miami continue to win one-score games for the most part against NC State and Virginia Tech on down the line, this isn't showing me a whole lot, because it's showing me that they're better, but they're really not putting the hammer down and crushing these teams. They're quality teams. Not that they should beat them 50-0, but they should be winning these games more in the 3-touchdown range. I'm looking at that North Carolina game all season, and we come up on that weekend, and I'm thinking, this is the game I want to see, because this is finally the team that's on the same level. Almost exactly should be at that point on the same level. And I got to say, Brad, had somebody told me Carolina wins this game 62-26, I would have been surprised, first of all, but then I would have thought, especially with what you mentioned about the cornerback situation being what it was as a sore spot, I would have thought Sam Howell bombed them. He just threw for 550 and 6 touchdowns, but he only had to throw the ball 19 times. To see the physical beating was alarming to me by both the offensive line and the backs just throwing a hip and a thigh at the secondary and the linebackers and just plowing people all day. Was a bit alarming. It was only one game, so I don't want to blow it out of proportion, but it was a bit alarming.
Unfortunately, you brought up the biggest point, though, Mark. That was the game that we all circled. That was the game where, like you said, this was make or break 2020. This is what's going to dictate if you're in the ACC championship, which is obviously the next goal in reality for the Miami Hurricanes. Is we have to get back to the ACC championship. We have to start winning the Coastal. And I think, unfortunately, you go back to 2019 and the terrible season we had then. You compare that 2019 to the 2020 season. I think between all the off-season hype and just being able to pull out close victories, don't get me wrong, we shouldn't be close games with some of the teams that we did in 2020. But I think, unfortunately, that was just a realistic next step for the Miami Hurricanes, is having to win close games, because I think that's something that our football team just wasn't used to doing. Anytime there was a close game in the past 5-6 years, we typically get blown out when it comes crunch time. And you saw in 2020, we at least, battled it out, and with the likes of De'Ara King and a few other guys, we were able to get a few extra wins. I mean, especially that special teams. You can't forget Andy Borregales and Lou Headley, who both ended up winning the awards for their position. I mean, those are two guys that without them two alone, we probably don't win 2 or 3 of those games in 2020.